Now it is time for fan questions, and uh, this week there's a couple that we've got, and they all kind of revolve around the same topic, and it's been through Twitter, it's been through email. So I'm going to read an email first, and then I'm going to read a tweet, and then I'll kind of, there's so many different aspects to this topic. We'll try and sift through it and get some true questions out of it. This is more of a statement email from a listener called Alan Suiters. And it said, the topic was in all caps, and it said Marvin Lewis. And it said, I became a Bengal fan when Boomer Esiason was quarterback and Sam Wyche was head coach. I stuck with them for so many years, but have given up on them because it seems that as long as fans are filling the seats, then Mike Brown is content. Marvin Lewis was an awesome defensive coordinator, but every good assistant coach will not always be a good head coach. Marvin Lewis is way overrated as a head coach. He is mediocre at best, as his very talented but undisciplined team that he has year after year struggles with opponents with record over 500. Coaching change is about 6 years overdue. So that's an email from Alan Suiters. We also got a tweet here from Jesse Bickers. Basically, we said, do you have any questions? And he said, again, a statement, lack of leadership and coaching. There are problems within the team itself, but those can be easily fixed, obviously pointing to coaching. So, Connor, let's start with you, and I'll circle back with you in a minute also on another topic. But you tend to think a bit higher, especially now, of Marvin Lewis than maybe a good portion of the fan base.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, and I don't think I'm alone in this. I think most of the people in the actual, like I say actual because we're, still a fan site, but the actual, like, Cincinnati media, Dave Lapham, those kind of guys, they all really still embrace Marvin Lewis as a coach. And personally, I look at Marvin Lewis and I see a coach who, yeah, his primetime record isn't great, and, all these things that you can indict him for. At the end of the day, he's still had a winning record with, the Bengals went 9-7 with a rookie quarterback and a rookie receiver leading the team. They had a not very talented team in Dalton's first 2 years and still managed to make the playoffs. 2013 comes around, that brutal Chargers loss happens in the playoffs. And what goes on stated in most of these games is that, I'm not trying to make excuses, but we really still haven't seen Marvin Lewis put in a chance to really, like, win a playoff. I mean, 2013, Geno Atkins was hurt in the playoffs, and you saw the Chargers run all over the Bengals, and you just you can't help but wonder what would it have been like if they had Geno Atkins. And 2014 rolls around, the entire roster is hurt. 2015 rolls around, Andy Dalton's hurt, and I'm not trying to just make excuses. Obviously, you still have to win those games. That's your job as a coach, and there have been a lot of Super Bowl champions that have had rosters that didn't have some of their best players. That being said, most of the recent Super Bowl champions have all been very healthy teams who haven't been losing any of their top players. But Lewis is a guy I still think people are saying he's a below average coach, which I just can't agree with. I mean, I think that if he were to be available, that half the league would want him immediately. And so, I guess that's just kind of where I stand on it.
It's an interesting stance, especially, and I was talking with someone this week about, if Lewis has truly had a fair shake in the playoffs because of the injuries. I don't know. Scott, I don't know if you want to maybe coattail off of that or talk about, those injuries in the postseason, maybe Lewis's primetime struggles. Do you think that just your overall thoughts, I guess, to start off this conversation?
Well, I think this is an interesting question because I actually have a post coming out, I think sometime in the next few days about Lewis and why I think the Bengals are not going to fire him or get rid of him, which is kind of interesting because a lot of the national media are saying, oh, it's time for him to go. It's time for him to go. They're going to get rid of him. He's on the hot seat.
He's not on the hot seat. Like that I think anyone who knows the team knows he's not on the hot seat.
Yeah, I think that's just national media speculation because, hey, he has a losing record. Obviously, he's on the hot seat. No, That's not the Bengals. And I think you kind of have to look at the history of Mike Brown. And going back to his first year as owner, he never really got along with Sam Weish. That first season, Sam Weish had a bad year. They went 3-13. They kind of had a falling out, pointed fingers at each other. End of the day, Weish was gone. Brown said Weish resigned. Weish said he fired him. Whatever happened, he got rid of him. He brought in, the hot, trendy young Shula. Shula was horrible. Stuck with him way too long. Probably because they didn't want to go through another Weish thing and then another bad coach. They just could not seem to get a good coach who could get that team to win. He brings in Marvin Lewis, and immediately they go from a 3-4 win team to a team that each year wins 7, 8, 9 games. Kind of erases that horrible decade in the 90s. And I think at that point, Mike Brown was like, "This is my guy. I don't want to go back to this horrible thing that happened after I got rid of the good coach my dad brought in. I got rid of this guy. We kind of had a falling out. Things went to hell for over a decade. I finally got someone in here who seems to know what he's doing. I'm just sticking with him forever." And if people want to say, yeah, they need to get rid of him or whatever, just look back to 2008. In 2005, they won the playoffs, or went to the playoffs. 2006, they had a down year. 2007 had a worse year. 2008 had a horrible year. So if you're going to get rid of him, most teams, that's what you get rid of him. No, they kept him. And then a few years later, they had another bad year in 2010. They kept him. They're off of 5 straight, playoff appearances. Yeah, they're having a crappy year right now, but I just don't see Mike Brown getting rid of him. If he didn't get rid of him in 2008 or 2010, he's not getting rid of him now.
It's a gamble at the end of the day. It's a move where what you have with Lewis, and we've seen another good point I heard today on Cincinnati radio. I believe it was Fox with Lapham, was that they were talking about the Bengals and the AFC North in general, and how every team in the AFC North has had a down year. The Ravens last year were a really bad team. And obviously they had injuries, but fans probably aren't just saying, Harbaugh should stick around. People want their coach fired whenever things don't go right. And, give him credit. The Ravens turned around. The Steelers wanted, they are eternally asking for Bill Cowher to return as the head coach. Bill Cowher was, I believe that's his name, right? Bill Cowher. My
Yes.
brain is mush right now. But before he won the Super Bowl, the Steelers had a really bad year, and fans were hoping that he would get axed. And that's not to say that Lewis is just going to suddenly turn this team around, but it's a gamble. Especially with the market right now, your best options are either guys who are first-year coordinator, would be first-year head coaches, or tenured veterans coaches who don't really have that Super Bowl caliber pedigree. And you look at, if you're Mike Brown, you look at Lewis and you see a guy who has consistently won games for you. And granted, he still hasn't won that elusive big game, but what you have with him. And I think if you're Brown, you think as long as you have a chance to get to the playoffs, which I think he thinks that the Bengals will have with Lewis next year, he's like Scott kind of said, it's loyalty, perhaps to a fault, but what you get with him, and that's a lot easier to deal with than a young, regardless of how you feel about these coaches that are young and potentially are going to be able to change. And that's why I say with Lewis, I don't hope he gets fired. I hope that for his own career and for the Bengals' sake, I hope that he finds a new home. And I think Lewis in Jacksonville fit for a coach who transformed a defense and helped a young team accomplish a lot. I think that'd be awesome for him. Or even to just move into the front office. I think there's a lot of stuff like that. Just reasons that Lewis retiring could be an actually legitimate option, and add that to the fact that they had that succession plan with Hugh Jackson. It's definitely something that he's going to consider. He's a person after all. He's going to go to bed one night and think about, well, is this right for me? Is this right for the Bengals? He has the team's best interest in mind just as well as he has his own. So it'll be interesting to watch, but from Brown's perspective, I think you have to understand why he feels that way. I think too many fans are just saying, Mike Brown ownership. There isn't a single fan base that loves its owner at the end of the day. except the Packers because their owners are their fans.
Or the Patriots. I mean, I think the Patriots are pretty happy with their owner, but
I mean, Bob Kraft, yeah, but even still, I think a lot of fans probably aren't. I mean, granted, yeah, they like him a lot more than most fans like their owners, but there's still even some probably that aren't huge fans.
To Scott's point, one of the reasons, aside from the more successful campaigns that Lewis has had compared to his predecessors with Mike Brown, is they have a great working relationship, and I think that plays a major factor into why Lewis has hung on so long. And if you read certain things from Jeff Hobson, who is the Bengals.com editor and has a good pulse on the team, he always notes that Mike Brown has also looked at the Steelers and noted the continuity of head coaches there. And even when they've had those disappointing 7-9, 8-8 seasons, they've still stuck with their coaches through some of those seasons. And they obviously have been successful. But I would like to say I think Lewis is gone after this year. Again, depending on how this record ends up and how the team ends up playing the rest of the season. But Lewis is under contract through 2017. My guess is that probably after that contract's up, they will let Lewis walk away after 2017 and not really do the firing thing. I think Brown trusts Lewis. I think they have a good working relationship, as I said, and I think he wants him to stick around. But personally speaking, I think it's time. I think we know what we have with Marvin Lewis, and yes, there's a risk, but this team has now gotten into this almost complacently comfortable culture going in within it, where not a lot of change, not a lot of free agency. Let's not rock the boat too much. Let's not change head coaches. And you're seeing similar or worse finishes year after year under Marvin Lewis, and he's done some great things. I think he's a good coach, and like the emailer said, I think he's a good coach. I don't think he's a great coach. I think he's probably akin to Marty Schottenheimer in the way that he can rebuild a terrible team and make it competitive, but can't win those big games, and that needs to change. And I think that a head coaching change would help that. Before we get out of here, one more little topic with these fan questions on Marvin Lewis, and again, we appreciate those coming our way. Connor, you put up a post about some possible head coaching candidates. Quickly, who are maybe a couple on the top of your wish list if the Bengals were to make a coaching change that are realistic, obviously?
Yeah. So I think the top guy has to be Kyle Shanahan, who's currently the Falcons' offensive coordinator. And before fans go and cite the whole, Dave Shula didn't work, why would another son of an NFL head coach work? Dave Shula was a guy who became a head coach 10 years after he started coaching, which is very, very early to just start head coaching. Kyle Shanahan, on the other hand, he's 36 years old, and this is his 8th year as an offensive coordinator, let alone a coach in the NFL. He's been coaching in the NFL for even longer than that. So, yeah, he's young, but he's the brightest. Well, I don't want to say brightest. He's the most innovative mind in the entire NFL. The Falcons' offense has completely transformed with him. The running game has been incredible. The passing game has been even better. And the blocking scheme, people are going to credit Alex Mack for the Falcons blocking. Well, what has happened is Kyle Shanahan has completely changed the Falcons scheme. They're doing a lot of different things with their zone blocking concepts, and they've turned guys like 2013 undrafted free agent right tackle Ryan Schrader into a guy who just got a huge extension. I mean, it's not just Alex Mack. It's not. You can't just say that an offensive line is playing well because of one player. That's a little bit ignorant of a statement to make. The entire Falcons offense has been great with Shanahan, and as we've seen with him before, he was a guy who spent a year in Cleveland. He's a guy who stands up for what he believes in the sense of he doesn't just want his bosses to tell him what to do. We saw him leave Cleveland because of the fact that the Browns ownership wanted him to start Johnny Manziel, and Shanahan did not want to start Manziel. Rather, he wanted to, make it. I don't remember. I think it might have been McCown who he wanted to start at quarterback, who ultimately ended up being the better player in that situation. So Shanahan has the pedigree as a young coach, and the offensive, he's gonna bring change, and that's something you want to see. But he's also the least risky, young, inexperienced, quote unquote. But he's a young guy who wouldn't necessarily, who has no NFL head coaching experience, but in the same sense wouldn't be a major gamble. I think another two guys who would make sense would be Panthers defensive coordinator Sean McDermott and Lions defensive coordinator Terrell Austin. Both run really similar schemes to Cincinnati with that two high safety coverage, running a lot of cover two and cover four concepts. And both of those guys have turned, kind of like Mike Zimmer and Paul Gunther. They've had those defenses that don't necessarily have the star power in the personnel, but have managed to turn those defenses into some of the NFL's best. We saw the Panthers last year; their front seven was unbelievable, and even without Josh Norman in the years preceding that and the year following that, they've Sean McDermott's secondary has been overachieving to the point where veteran guys who've just been cast-offs like Kurt Coleman have been outstanding playmakers. And then Terrell Austin in Detroit has developed or has helped the Lions, despite losing Ndamukong Suh and Nick Fairley, turn into one of the best defenses in the NFL. And we see even this year, Ziggy Ansah, who was, I think he had double-digit sacks last year. I think he had the same amount as Carlos Dunlap with 13.5. He had 0 sacks this year, but despite that, another defensive end, I forget his name, has 7 or 8 sacks of his own, and Detroit's defense has really been stepping up despite the huge Suh loss was something that was something that you wouldn't think the team would just be able to quickly turn around from. And then a couple other guys, offensive minds, Mike Shula, another guy, brother of Dave Shula, who obviously fans are going to criticize for, but he's been a coach since 1988, and he's worked his way up. He became an offensive coordinator for the first time in '96. Was the head coach of Alabama for 3 years, had a up and down stint there. He's been the offensive coordinator for Carolina since 2013, and obviously he's best known for helping the Panthers, despite losing Kelvin Benjamin before the season even started, become a Super Bowl offense, and that was huge. Harold Goodwin of the Cardinals helped transform Bruce Arians' team from they had the Kevin Kolb days where they were one of the worst offenses in the NFL. And this year has been a little bit of a down year, but we saw last year the Cardinals were a huge team. The offense was amazing. Carson Palmer had a career renaissance. David Johnson has been great. Chris Johnson was a completely different player last year than he was in any year previous after his 2,000-yard seasons. And then the last guy I'll mention is Anthony Lynn, Bill's offensive coordinator now, who started the season as the running backs coach. It was reported he had I think it was 4 interviews, and maybe it's because of the Rooney Rule, but he's a guy who the Bills' offense had really not been playing well prior to him being promoted after the Bills fired Greg Roman. But Anthony Lynn has the resume to become a head coach, and we've seen this year with the Bills' offense running at almost a historic pace. And Tyrod Taylor's development as a quarterback. It's just an offense where they've been playing really well. Obviously, there's going to be guys. There's more Josh McDaniels and Matt Patricia, the Patriots coordinators. Personally, I'm not a big fan because neither guy has had that success outside of New England. That being said, they're two guys who have been around Bill Belichick and learned from one of the greatest coaches of all time. Other names I'll toss out, but I don't need to really say much on. Jim Bob Cooter, Jim Schwartz, Todd Haley, Leslie Frazier. Obviously, Paul Gunther could be an internal promotion, or Vance Joseph, the now Dolphins defensive coordinator after he was the defensive backs coach for a while in Cincinnati. Guys who I think will come up in conversation but won't be options. Obviously, you have the college coaches. I don't think the Bengals are going to hire anyone from college. The only guy I would really like is Jim Harbaugh, but even all these guys, Harbaugh, Saban, Urban Meyer, they're all comfortable where they are. I don't think they're going to try to make their way up to the NFL. Guys I think that should not be options but will come up in conversation, Tom Coughlin, John Gruden. Tom Coughlin's 71 years old, and I just don't understand how he would relate to a 23-year-old in an NFL locker room. And it's been 4 or 5 years since his Super Bowl, and I know people like his fiery personality, but ultimately I'm not one of the opinion that a fiery personality is what makes a head coach good. Generally, I look for being someone who's a hothead. And Gruden is, like with the college coaches, is comfortable where he's at. So I'm curious what you guys think of these guys. Obviously, what I say isn't just, don't take it as gospel like a lot of people take PFF's word for gospel. I mean, that's just my opinion. Do your own research. But there's a lot of legitimate coaching options out there. And there could be guys who get fired from maybe an incompetent organization who, could be potential coaching candidate. Mike McCarthy's a very similar coach to Marvin Lewis, but he's had success and has won a Super Bowl. Ron Rivera, Bruce Arians, I don't think either one will get fired, but if they were, that's an immediate hire. Even guys like the Jets head coach Todd Bowles, I think would be an interesting fit. So there'll be a lot of intriguing options, but it's interesting to look around. I'll say that.
Scott, I think the only two people left off of Connor's list were you and I. And if you have a chance, by the way, Connor did a very nice write-up on a lot of those coaches and those candidates on Cincy Jungle, so check that out. Scott, any thoughts on some of those names thrown out there? Any of those on your wish list?
I think the one thing I would say is I would probably whittle his list down a little bit. Just looking at Mike Brown's history, the 4 head coaches that he's brought in since he got rid of Sam Weish have all been former coordinators. Dave Shula was offensive coordinator, I think, in Dallas. Bruce Kozlet was an offensive coordinator and former head coach. Dick LeBeau was a Bengals defensive coordinator and had been around. And Marvin Lewis had been defensive coordinator and also, I think, an assistant head coach for a year with the Redskins before he got hired. So I think if he brings anyone in, it's not going to be a college guy. Probably wouldn't be, a up-and-comer who isn't at the assistant level yet, but I think it's got to be either an offensive or defensive coordinator and probably someone who has had a couple jobs, kind of worked his way up the ladder, someone who has a track record or resume. I think that's probably the only legitimate person he'd bring in. But as we said earlier, I'd be really surprised if he does bring someone in. It kind of reminds me of that G.K. Chesterton quote that how a good novel tells you about the hero, but a bad novel tells you about the author, which basically means if your coach is good, he's kind of like a long snapper. You don't really think about him, but you look at the result. So if the coach is good enough, you're just looking at what's happening on the field. But when your team's bad, you look at the coach because he's the easiest component to get rid of. So obviously I understand why a lot of people want to get rid of Marvin Lewis because, the team's struggling and you're looking at the author of that team. And that is obviously Marvin Lewis. But at the end of the day, I think that Mike Brown thinks that, no, he's still a good author. He's given us many good teams where we didn't have to think about Lewis. We didn't have to think about the lack of in-game adjustments, the kind of odd use of timeouts and challenges. We just look at, hey, they seem to be winning. Doesn't matter that they keep playing bad veterans over better younger people. We keep winning, and we're kind of happy with that. So, at the end of the day, I think it'll be a moot point, and unless something just truly bizarre happens, I'm going to say the most likely hire is the guy we have.
I liked all those names, and there was a couple that I didn't think of, Connor, that you brought up. But Todd Haley is an interesting one as well. That kind of piqued my interest a little bit. But you look at things. My pipe dream would be Jim Harbaugh. But you look at, we talked about the friction between an outspoken, fiery coach like Sam Weish and Mike Brown's early days as an owner. That you heard about Harbaugh and his supposed disagreements with 49ers management, even though he led them to massive success in a short window of time.
He'd be awesome.
He would be great, but I don't see it.
And he's so comfortable in Michigan right now. I don't think he's even gonna. I think the one thing I didn't really talk about is that the Bengals position is like one of the most desirable positions that will be open if it were to be open. They have a talented roster, an owner that's willing to give up control and support the coach and won't just give up on him after a season or two of bad seasons. That's a desirable opening, and so who knows? Maybe it does spark a guy like Harbaugh to interview for it. I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, and I don't know fully about the control aspect, but I do think about job security. I think that's definitely true, Connor. The one guy, and I know he was way down on your pecking order, the one guy I see, especially with Hugh Jackson seeming to at least make it, even regardless of how Cleveland finishes this year, it sounds like he's going to stay there for at least 2 or 3 years. Given what we heard about Jackson getting a supposed succession plan from Lewis, given the team's comfortability with Lewis's staff and a promote from within type of mentality per se, the guy I see is Vance Joseph. And even though he's not with the team currently, if you remember, he was with the team for 2 years. And after the 2014 season, Mike Brown actually made the decision to block Vance Joseph for defensive coordinator interviews after that season. And I don't remember exactly who was, because at that point he was a secondary coach. Yeah, he blocked him, and he didn't want him to leave. And I think obviously Lewis was probably in his ear at that point too. But he made the executive decision to say, "Hey, look, we're keeping him. He's not going to interview." But then the next year he said, "Okay, you know what? I blocked you for another year. You can, he's actually been a guy for all of his criticisms. He's actually been a guy who's been generous with his coordinators and other guys to get interviews for other jobs and promotions elsewhere." So pat on the back to Mike Brown for that. But I think Vance Joseph, especially with the turnaround you saw from the Dolphins this year, midway through the season, I believe they're now 7-4. I think they were at one point 1-4, 1-3. And I think a big part of that has been the defense as well as good play from Ryan Tannehill. But I think Vance Joseph, from a comfortability standpoint, you heard things earlier this year, a rumor about secondary players really missing Vance Joseph, as a secondary coach, and they really, really liked him. Some guys came out and said he was the best coach they ever had. I just see that being the fit if the Bengals were to make a move. And then also that would help, if Marvin does transition into maybe a front office role, that sort of thing. There's obviously a good working relationship there between Joseph and Lewis, so that just would make sense. The one caveat there would be Joseph overseeing Paul Gunther, who used to be his boss.
Exactly. That's kind of my one thing is if Brown wanted Gunther over Joseph to the point where he was willing to let Joseph walk, I mean, I would think that he would just promote Gunther to head coach if he really was picking between those two. Right.
But the other thing is, too, that you have to look at from a macro perspective is, if the Bengals make a change at head coach, not only staff changes, but also, as weird as it may sound for all the Andy Dalton supporters, potentially some sort of quarterback change or philosophy change that could come with that. And that's a totally different topic for another time. But thank you guys for your opinions on this. It was great. Great topics, great questions from our listeners. Again, one last time, you can get in touch with us via Twitter at BengalsOBI, via email, theobinsider@gmail.com. You can subscribe to get all of our material on our SoundCloud and YouTube channels. You can also join us live on YouTube every week as we record this show. And you can also check out Cincy Jungle, not only for the material that we all put up as co-hosts of this show, but also this show is available to be streamed on that website as well. So check out all of our stuff through those platforms, as well as the stuff on Cincy Jungle. Gentlemen, let's get out of here. Hopefully the Bengals turn the tide this week, I guess, right?
I mean,
one thing I've noticed, we are 0-3 since Donald Trump won the election.
Oh,
and he seems to love tweeting. So since you mentioned our Twitter, maybe he can tweet something for us. Maybe fire the team up or something.
Make the Bengals great again.
Yes.
3 a.m. rant. Just they need a 3 a.m. rant from Donald Trump.
That's what we need. Make the Bengals great again. And on that note, folks, we will leave you. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for downloading the show. Even though it's a rough season, hoo day.
Hoo day.